All right. So first, I just want to remind everybody, as I just said, we're going to be recording this session. So anybody who is unable to join, or if you want to come back, if you want to go back to this and listen to one of the presentations, this is going to be recorded and shared with everybody who RSVP'd. We'll also share the slides. So if you RSVP'd, if you are in the Zoom link, you will get a copy of this to go back and watch. First, I want to thank everybody who joined, all of the attendees, and I want to thank our speakers for taking time. I know everyone is really busy right now, so I really appreciate that you all were able to kind of come together and help us think through this stuff. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Angie. I live in Palo Alto. I'm in the Crescent Park neighborhood with my family and dog, all of whom may come in during this webinar. Palo Alto Forward has really put this panel together. We're really a group of Palo Alto residents who believe in the potential of Palo Alto in our city. And we work together toward a vision really of a more affordable, sustainable city by supporting more housing, more transportation choices, and climate change initiatives. So often advocates for each of these issues are kind of siloed, but we believe at looking at all of these things in a more holistic way and a really thoughtful, cohesive planning process. So tonight's meeting is actually to help all of us, including me, really understand the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, and how it works. So my goal for this meeting is to really have at least a handful of you leave this meeting with kind of a better sense of what the process is, how to engage in it, and really, I see this as an incredible opportunity for us to make space for new neighbors, and I hope that all of you will see that at least at the end of this too. So for the agenda, so that you know what we're going to be doing, first we're going to have Steve Levy talk about RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and then we're going to hear from Matthew Reed from SV at Home about housing ordinance. And then we will hear from Bella Chu from Redwood City about their housing goals and what they've been doing there. And then at the end of the session, we've saved time for Q&A. And this is the part that I want to make sure everybody understands. So let me take a little second to explain the Q&A for anybody who hasn't gotten on a lot of Zoom webinars. It's a little different from the meetings version of webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a chat box, and you're going to see a couple of other things. One of the other things is a Q&A box. It might be at the bottom of your screen. It might be at the top of your screen. So I'm going to put this poll up. So do you see the Q&A tab? It's totally okay if you don't. I mostly want to make sure you can see it. Okay, so the Q&A tab is where you will put questions that you want to be answered at the bottom. So as I said in the agenda, we're going to hear these three presentations, and then we're going to get into questions. You can put all of your burning questions into the Q&A tab at any point, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentations. So just one more reminder, the chat is for the attendees to talk to each other. You guys can have all the conversations you want over there, and then the Q&A is where you want to put your questions for us to get to. All right, as I said, I have children, so I overly explain things sometimes. I'm going to end the poll. I see one person has not found the Q&A tab, but if you go into that chat box, hopefully somebody in there can help you. And also my colleague from SV at Home, Mitch, is on, and so hopefully he'll be able to find you in the chat box. Okay, I'm gonna end this poll. Great, okay, so one last community reminder. I like to say this before we kick things off. I hope that everyone came to this with really positive intentions. We all have kind of different experiences and perspectives, and sometimes they can divide us, but I hope that we will be able to use that diversity to thrive. So let's enter this conversation, let's enter this webinar with positive intentions. And with that, I'm going to hand things off to Steve to share his screen and kick off the RHNA presentation.
Okay, let's see if I can qualify for screen share. Does that do it, Angie?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. I'm Steve Levy. I work on this professionally for regional planning agencies in California. I've lived in Palo Alto for 50 years and now live downtown and am a member of the Palo Alto Forward Board. So the regional housing needs assessment has two parts. The first part is under state law. Every 8 years, the State Department of Housing and Community Development gives every region a housing unit target for the next 8 years, a planning target. That target is split into 4 different income groups, the number of units that areas should plan for very low income, moderate, and above income groups. When that is done, the regional agency, in this case, the Association of Bay Area Governments, develops a methodology to allocate the regional total to cities. The state allocation, the HCD allocation, is required by state law, and the methodology is based on a series of legislative moves. In this current cycle, the legislature asked HCD to do 2 new things: to include a methodology that minimizes the number of people who are living in overcrowded units and minimizes the number of people who are cost burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income for housing. The other parts of the methodology have been around for several years, replacing demolished units, achieving a normal vacancy rate, and accounting for population growth and changes in household formation behavior. For example, will young adults live with their parents when they're 50? The Bay Area got a large allocation, as did all regions. We got a planning target of 441,000 units. Now, the reason it's higher than before is that we did poorly. Not just Palo Alto, but all cities have done poorly over the past 8 years. And there's an element of catch-up. So if you look at the chart, a large share of the units that we need to plan for are to reduce overcrowding and to bring our vacancy rate back to normal. Actually, the amount of housing growth that's related to growth is virtually the same as it was before. In this methodology, HCD used the population growth projections from the State Department of Finance, which are relatively lower than recent levels of growth. And though there's been some confusion about it, HCD did not take into account Bay Area future job growth in the determination. There are 2 choices that HCD made that reduced the number of units comparable to what they have done in other regions. The first, which makes a lot of sense, is that in other regions, when they looked at overcrowding or they looked at cost burden, they were comparing that region to the whole United States, not just areas like us. So we were being compared to Mississippi and Kansas as well as Austin and Seattle. This time, they compared us to comparable regions that have lots of overcrowding and lots of cost burdening. And in doing that, they reduced the number of units that we need to get back to a comparable average. And the second was to use the Department of Finance population projection. If they had used the one from ABAG, we probably would have been asked to do maybe 100,000 more units. Here's a breakdown by units. And because the methodology now accounts for overcrowding and for reducing the number of cost-burdened households, it meant that a large share of the planning target was for very low and low-income units. Virtually less than half, about 40% of the target was for market rate or above average units. And that's because we're trying to remediate overcrowding and reduce the number of cost-burdened households. What happens with this, and Matthew will go into that in a lot of detail, is that these are planning targets. And that means communities like Palo Alto or Redwood City or Mountain View are asked to design housing elements that have enough sites to meet the target and have a set of policies that can incentivize market rate and nonprofit developers to build the housing. The Bay Area has its target. Currently, there is a methodology committee that's formed in ABAG to suggest a methodology for allocating the units to cities in unincorporated area. They will make a recommendation, but the final determination will be made by the city council people and county supervisors that make up the ABAG board. Okay. Let's see if I skipped a slide. Okay. The allocation methodology that's currently being favored, although there's some nuances, but it's being broadly favored and it will be brought forward, has two criteria. One is to allocate an above average share of housing units to what are called high resource or opportunity areas. And the second is to allocate an above average share to cities where housing can be closer to jobs. Palo Alto and most cities on the peninsula, Redwood City, Mountain View, rank high on both of those criteria, and they will, if the methodology committee suggestion is adopted, get a very large share of the regional units. The high opportunity resource area addresses two issues. There's substantial research, first from Stanford, but then from elsewhere, that low-income children and their parents do better if they happen to live in high resource areas. So that's one reason for the committee recommendation. The second is they don't want to end up concentrating low-income housing in the places where it's already in large supply. So they're trying to diversify where the low and very low-income housing goes. The jobs housing balance criteria is really to reduce the amount of commuting, not eliminating it. Everybody doesn't live where they work, but if you can live on the peninsula or near it, that's a lot closer to your job than if you have to commute from Los Banos or Merced or Tracy. I see there is a question on the screen, Angie.
It's okay, Steve. You don't have to respond to it. It's just one of the polls.
Well, okay, I will try and get it off. Our council, Palo Alto, like many cities, asked the allocation committee for the lowest possible target. That's not unusual. Cities, many cities try and reduce the planning requirement that they're about to get because they're very difficult. But based on the last Housing Methodology Committee meeting, Palo Alto, my city, is looking for a target of about 7,000 or more units compared to the 2,000 that we have now. As I said before, about 40% are for market rate housing, but the other 60% include a lot of catch up and for very low and moderate income families. I'm now going to turn it over to Matthew, who's going to explain in more detail how cities are asked to respond to their housing unit target through their new housing element that will have to be developed.
Great, thanks, Steve. Let me see if I can share screen. Here we go, my beautiful picture. I am Matthew Reed. I'm the policy manager at Silicon Valley at Home. We try very hard to be the voice of affordable housing in Santa Clara County. And we try the best we can to provide both advocacy around affordable housing opportunities, but also education and information and assistance in cases like these when there's a complex process, so that city staff and members of the community can engage fully in the opportunities to shape the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we get from the allocations to the actual housing element process, and I'm going to focus on the impact of recent legislation. Under California law, every city and county is required to adopt a general plan, which outlines anticipated growth, how that growth is going to occur, and what the policies that the city will put in place to accommodate that growth. And one of the required pieces of the general plan is the housing element. The state requires that every city use the housing element to plan for existing and projected housing needs. This means the new RHNA obligations. Housing elements have to be updated every 7 to 8 years, and we're currently in the 6th housing element cycle. Most jurisdictions will begin this work at the beginning of next year, and it will run through next year into 2022. A key piece of the housing element is that it has to include an inventory of land for residential development. And the purpose of this site inventory is to identify suitable and available sites with enough capacity for residential development to hold to the city's RHNA obligations at all income levels. And the sites must have appropriate design standards, they have to have infrastructure, the zoning has to match the intended use. Because historically, cities throughout the state have generally failed to meet their RHNA obligations, over the last 3 years, the state legislature has passed a number of laws which increase and clarify requirements around the site inventory of the housing element to make sure that cities have clarity on how these new laws need to be applied. So the first one that we'll talk about, and at the end of my presentation, I don't want you to be distracted. I will put some links into the HCD site so that you can track this at home. So the first piece of legislation was pretty simple. It was Senate Bill 6. And it basically mandates that cities have to upload their site inventories to HCD's website at the state level. And so they will be transparent, they will be accessible, they will be in electronic form. Folks can track to see where housing is allowed, and community members will have access to that information as the process unfolds. The next law was Senate Bill 166. And we call this the no net loss law. And essentially it says that you have to have sufficient adequate sites available at all times so that once you've set your housing element in place and you've shown that you can accommodate all of the allocations and the growth needs, if there are changes during the 8 years in which you're implementing that housing element, you have to show that there will not be a net loss of housing opportunities. So if a city approves a development that is less dense than it was identified in its housing element, or it was identified as affordable housing, and then it's developed as market rate, they have to shift capacity or add additional sites to remain compliant. 1486, AB 1486, clarified a long-standing law that said that any city or publicly owned property that was going to be sold off or leased for a long-term lease for some other use they needed to notify affordable housing developers or some other public serving entity before they can dispose of that land in any other way. AB 686 is called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. This was passed in 2018. And although it's been in place, it's going to have its most significant effect during this RHNA housing element cycle. And it is a driving part of what's shaping the methodology right now as they determine which cities within the region are going to have which level of allocation goals. And basically it says that we want to have integrated, accessible communities for everybody. So the sites identified in the housing element have to be identified in a way that allows affordable housing to be in places that it doesn't perpetuate racial or economic segregation. That lower income units, affordable housing units shouldn't be concentrated in low resourced areas. And that in fact, we should identify sites for affordable housing that affirmatively are located near high-performing schools and jobs. So the main bill, which was passed in 2017, that reformed the RHNA process was AB 1397. There are a lot of pieces here, so I've actually collectively, my team and I have summarized them on the slides, but there's a fair amount of detail. I will post the link, and I'm more than willing to answer questions. In this round, cities not only have to identify sites that are available for housing development, but they have to identify sites that are that are available for affordable housing. So they have to identify within their inventory map exactly where they plan to build the affordable housing necessary to meet their goals. They have to be able to show that the capacity is reasonable for those sites, that you could actually accommodate the planned development in those areas. If housing element relies on non-vacant sites, sometimes cities say, here's a underutilized office park, we plan to redevelop it as housing, and they put that in their housing element. If you plan to do that, if 50% or more of your planned housing is on these places that are already full of other things, you have to show a plan and show some agreements with existing landowners that you're going to be able to have access to this land. There has to be an assessment of whether or not the sites are feasible, if they're too small or too large, and whether or not they have available infrastructure, meaning are they already connected for electric and sewer? Historically, many cities have identified sites that aren't actually developable because they're not plugged into the infrastructure of the city for housing. So we covered a number of these points. I think the important thing to acknowledge is that now they're asking you to actually specify locations. And so a lot of the new rules are around how and why a certain piece of land is going to be able to be developable in the future as housing. Finally, they're asking cities to go back and look at past housing elements and past inventories. So if an area was identified in a previous housing element and was identified as a place that previous RHNA goals would be met in previous cycles, the city will have to have a detailed plan for how that specific site is going to be rezoned within 30 years, and it will have to have an increase of 20% or more affordable. Historically, cities have reused the same sites in their inventory, and the state legislature has decided that they want to discourage that. And finally, if you plan on redeveloping a site that is currently a deed-restricted affordable housing site, it must be redeveloped at higher density, and it must show that it will replace the existing affordable housing that would be lost. I think I've lost control of the screen. Is there a chance that that's because of the poll?
I don't think so, but we can end the poll. It's very interesting to see how many people who are on have not participated in housing element processes. So your section is really, really helpful.
Well, we're in for a treat.
Yeah. Did that change anything?
It did not. Huh. Okay, well, there weren't too many at the end, so let me summarize. One big question is there's been a lot of legislation that has reformed the laws that govern local ordinances for accessory dwelling units. And so the question is, how will ADUs be incorporated into the site inventory? And the answer is that they can be, but it has to be reasonable, and it has to be based on current trends, either since the law went into place in 2018 or a 5-year average before 2018. So many cities have seen a significant increase in ADU development, and they will be able to make some projections based on those trends and count that housing in the housing inventory. So traditionally, cities have had a very large number of units that they've needed to accommodate, and they've been left largely to themselves to figure out how and where those units are going to be accommodated. And then they submit a plan to the Department of Housing and Community Development, which reviews the plan and approves it, and then the city is off and running for the next 8 years. Because there are more rules this time, HCD is trying to provide significant amount of guidance to cities on how this should be implemented. And we'll be looking at the city's plans and whether or not it's followed the guidance as it approves the housing elements for the next cycle. The truth is, housing community development does not have the staff capacity to challenge every city's housing element and whether or not it complies. So a lot of this process is going to be up to engagement from local communities and the efforts of staff to do a good job of implementing the laws as they stand to make sure that we have housing opportunity for everybody going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Was that the end of it? I'm sorry.
No, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So with that, we're going to hand it off to Bella. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me just get my slides up here. Timer. disclaimer so I don't go over time. So good evening, everyone. My name is Isabella Chu, and I'm the founder of Redwood City Forward. As I'm sure you can figure out from the logo, the inspiration for Redwood City Forward was actually Palo Alto Forward. I had reached out to our city and said, hey, I just want you to know I'm a new resident and I'm not upset about development. And they said, can you please voice that publicly? So I started Redwood City Forward, and then at first it was kind of a slow start, and then I started really understanding housing a lot better, and have been very engaged for the last 5 years. And just a little bit about me, my background, my professional work is in population health sciences, and a lot of times population health winds up being the study of things that should work, but don't. And being able to move to prosperous places, your zip code is one of the most powerful determinants of life expectancy, of long-term health, of any kind of outcome that we want to measure, that we want to see. Allowing people to move to prosperous places is the most powerful intervention I've ever seen. So just a little bit of data. This is a kernel plot of the probability of surviving till 70 for every county in the United States where there's enough people to make this calculation. As you can see, there's a huge dispersion. And at the top end, this is places like, Santa Clara County, San Mateo County. If you're a Black male in a place like, Palo Alto, you have almost a 78% chance of making it till 70. Whereas if you're in one of the poorest counties in the United States, it's about half of that. And you see the same pattern for every group that we measure this with. And sort of the women tend to do better than men and they have a higher and tighter curve, but this pattern reproduces itself in every country, throughout history, and all over the United States. So this really got me very interested in land use policy and housing. And Steve alluded to it, but and I remember seeing this is all largely based on the work of Raj Chetty. He was at Stanford, and then those losers at Harvard took him. Actually, he's doing incredible work. But I remember him saying that he's actually an economist, not a health scientist, but that the ability to move from an area of low opportunity to an area of high opportunity is the most powerful, kind of economic intervention that we have, so that there's a monotonic dose response in the kids that for every year of childhood they have in the high opportunity area, their outcomes are better with regard to income at age 26, college completion, family formation, kind of everything good we know how to measure does better when a kid is able to grow up in a high opportunity area. This is some more of his work. So looking actually at life expectancy. So above a certain point, it kind of doesn't matter where you live. You just have to make more money. And for men, that point is around 70,000 a year. Although I would point out that you're much more likely to make more than 70,000 a year if you're living in a place like San Mateo or Santa Clara County than you are in a low opportunity area. So, even though that impacts your income, but below that cutoff, these lines really start to spread out so that at the lowest end of the income spectrum, you see up to a 5-year difference in life expectancy. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this effect, if you eliminated cancer in this population, you'd only see a 3-year life gain. So this is a huge effect size. You see the same pattern with women. If the lines converge at around 55,000 a year, women tend to be more resilient to economic adversity. There's a lot of research going into why that is, but again, this pattern repeats itself just about everywhere we've looked. So allowing people to live in a high opportunity area impacts every aspect of their lives. And then this is actually a very specific Bay Area example, and it's kind of funny. A lot of times with these kinds of things, people are like, well, maybe the Bay Area is different. It's not, and he's reproduced this everywhere. This is a child who, this is data from children who've moved from Oakland to San Francisco at age 9, and you see this monotonic dose response, and then it kind of poops out at around age 23. So I personally feel very strongly about family housing in particular, or housing for young people, just because you see such powerful effects from moving to high opportunity areas. So this is the Redwood City goals and our productions. So we've done really well at producing market rate housing. We've done kind of okay at producing low and not very good at all at producing very low and almost no moderate. And I think this may be an error. I was trying to look at the data and find better information, but this is what I was able to find, and I will amend this if I find a correction. But, you know, I think a lot of times people are like, oh, Redwood City is doing great, but we're just doing kind of more than the minimum. And in many cases, we're not even doing the minimum, but at least we have built housing over the last 10 years. And, you know, my hope is that producing sufficient housing preserves diversity. And this is actually census data from the 2000 to the 2010 census, the kind of building boom. And by that, I mean just building regular amounts of housing in Redwood City didn't really start until around 2012, 2013. So I'll be looking to the 2020 census. I really hope this trend continues. So we have seen an increase in racial diversity, and my hope is that building that much housing has helped to preserve socioeconomic diversity, although in my opinion, that's very much in peril. If we don't build enough housing, if we don't start producing that low end and very low income housing, this pattern is not going to hold. But anecdotally, Redwood City is one of the most racially and socioeconomically diverse cities on the peninsula. And then some really interesting things have happened over the past couple years that kind of give me a lot of hope that we will be able to continue to produce housing. So three things have happened. One is that we've gone from odd year elections to even year elections. That tends to have a higher rate of participation among younger people, people of color, and they tend to be more in favor of more housing. The second thing that's happened is that we've gone to district elections, and this has already resulted in a presumptive, candidacy and council seat going to a young African-American renter. In a district that is, I think, 77% renters who has not had any representation in over a decade. So that's an incredibly exciting development. And then I think one of the most stunning things that's happened is as we've gone to online participation, I've just seen an explosion in the number of people coming to meetings and the diversity of people coming to meetings. And I think that's just for very practical reasons. In order to be able to show up for 5 hours to comment for 3 minutes on a Monday night, you need ample time and resources. And going to online participation means that somebody with children at home, with a really intense work schedule, who's even at work, can participate. They can listen in the background, hop on for those 3 minutes, and then continue to listen while they're taking care of their responsibilities. And so I'm personally really hoping that we remain with this online, format going forward. And then the thing that I'm really hoping that we can really learn is who else are we missing? By changing just that one thing, we've seen a huge increase in diversity of participation. Could we do better? And I'm sure that we could. So that's hopefully the next step. And that's it. And I know we have a special session for comments and questions, so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much. So we're gonna hop into Q&A, and I'm actually gonna start with a question that I'm going to hand to Bella, because I know you have to hop off shortly. Where did it go? Okay, so I think one of the questions that we got, and again, any of you can answer this if you agree, disagree, but I thought I'd hand it first to Bella. So why has PAZ is a local Palo Alto group, why are there groups that are coming out requesting that the council take immediate action to block the implementation of the RHNA determination? Why do people block housing?
Okay, I was like, so human beings by their very nature are tribal and territorial. And in every civilization in history, when one group of people has an advantage, they tend to want to hang on to it. And so as a practical matter, as a homeowner, I'm a homeowner, my economic incentives are 100% like to cap the amount of housing where it is. And I think there's more to it than that. I think people, just prefer things the way they are. And they really don't experience any downside to blocking housing. And so I think that there's a lot of that. I don't want to speculate too much about motivations, but I will note that, after, after desegregation, there was kind of an explosion in exclusionary zoning. And I think, honestly, keeping housing in limited supply is a really convenient way to homogenize neighborhoods socioeconomically and frankly, because of historic injustices racially. And I think if people want to keep their neighborhoods exclusive or the same, that's how you do it, is you block new housing.
Angie? Yeah, I don't want to get into motivation. That doesn't go anyplace. But what's true in Palo Alto and most cities is that the people who don't want that much more housing around them tend more to be homeowners. And homeowners are often more active in local politics than renters. Our city is like 55% homeowners and 45% renters. And I'm hard pressed to think of any renters I know or can think of who would be opposed to policies that could reduce overcrowding and reduce the cost of housing. So I think there's a homeowner renter split in who's active.
I agree.
All right. Next question. I'm going to kind of just shoot these off. Okay, next question. For cities that are successful in meeting their RHNA numbers, their regional housing needs allocation numbers, what revenue sources do they use to fund housing for low-income families? And I'll let any of you answer that.
I can take that on. It is a challenge. There are multiple ways in which cities raise local dollars and then leverage county, state, and federal resources. So at a local level, pretty much every city in the county has an inclusionary housing ordinance, which requires that if you build new market rate apartments, either a certain proportion of them will be set aside for lower income households, or you will pay a fee to the city, which the city will use to build affordable housing for those folks that you didn't provide the housing for. Pretty much every city in the county collects a fee on commercial development. So as you build more jobs, you increase the demand for housing, and cities collect a fee from commercial developers that goes into a fund that is used to build affordable housing. Some cities have other measures in place. The city of San Jose passed a ballot measure that has a tax on transfer of property. It's called Measure E, and that's expected to generate anywhere from $10 to $40 million a year for more affordable housing. The local dollars are important because they then leverage money from other, usually at about a 4-to-1 ratio. So if a city puts one piece in, there's resources from the county, there are affordable housing dollars from the state, and then there are federal resources. Complexity of what those resources, probably more than we need here, but essentially there's a local piece and then there are other pieces that get leveraged. But I think it's a very good point because it is a real challenge for us to build the affordable housing that we need. And in some ways acknowledging that at a local level, what we can do is make it easier so it costs less and takes less time. Is often the best thing that we can do to make the most out of the resources that we do have at the local level.
Yeah, Angie?
Yeah.
Most people that think about this know that we're going to need very substantial, not city funding. So there's an effort to create a regional fund of $1.5 billion paid for partly by development fees, as Matthew said, partly by local bonds, partly by cities offering their surplus land, and some taxes, also money from philanthropic organizations. I think it's wrong to think that most low-income housing projects are funded solely or even primarily by cities. The need is so great. We're going to need state bonds and regional funding. And the last point that Matthew said, we want to make our dollars go as far as we can. So there's always a battle about density, about parking requirements, about things that add to the cost. So you get fewer units than you might have if the cost were lower.
Great, thank you. Bella, did you have anything to add?
Nope.
Yep. So affordable housing cobbles together a lot of different funding sources. It's very complicated, but we need more. All right, so the next question, somewhat related kind of to what Steve was pointing out around surplus lands, how are land costs considered in site inventory, especially for low-income housing sites? In past cycles, Palo Alto identified sites like Whole Foods lot downtown in our inventory for less than 20 units of homes. Not likely to actually result in redevelopment. How might things be different this time around?
I'll take a crack and then defer to Matthew. What Matthew said is that new state law wants cities to inventory sites that are financially feasible, and my city's been a villain in that. That means, for example, in our low-income housing project at Wilton Court, was originally zoned for 11 units an acre. We got it rezoned to make it feasible to build 59 units. We waived a retail requirement that would have cost the developer money. So the city needs to do things in its zoning and in its other cost requirements that make that project feasible to a nonprofit developer. And HCD will be looking, Matthew said they won't look at everyone, but I can guarantee you that Redwood City and Palo Alto and cities like us are on the top of the list to make sure that our sites are financially feasible.
Yeah, I didn't say they wouldn't look at everyone. They do have to approve every housing element that comes across their desk. I think what I was saying was really the work begins at home. And rather than wait to have the work that's done locally challenged at the state level. And I agree, Steve, there will be some cities that will, that will get a little extra attention. So correct. The real challenge this time is that there's actually gonna have to be plans for how this is actually going to be implemented. And there's still gonna be limits, and it's still gonna be really hard. But the planning process of identifying sites, figuring out what type of housing is going to go on those sites, at what density, and at what densities are going to be required in order to accommodate all of the growth that's been allocated to the cities. So I know there's been a lot of pushback on the total numbers and the expectations. And what the state law says is that once your allocation has been received, your job is to come up with a plan to build that housing. And so it will be a very important process as cities go through this. It's always a challenge, and it's going to be even more challenging.
Thank you. All right, next question. Does the new property tax revenue from the additional built homes offset or is greater than the additional cost of increased population for the city? And is it possible, and the possible decrease in property value? And I'm gonna hand that to Matthew.
I'm not sure exactly, did I click on that one?
You did. I didn't assign that to you on purpose. I'm gonna read it one more time to make sure you get all of the pieces of it.
Okay.
So, so that all of our speakers can hear this. So does the new property tax revenue from additional built homes offset, or is it greater than the additional cost of increased populations for the city? So the new tax
Right.
dollars.
Okay, got it. So the reality is that the most expensive type of housing for a city to accommodate in terms of city services is a single family home. If you build higher density housing, there are locational efficiencies that make it much, much easier to deliver city services. And so in terms of the general question of does housing pay for itself, actually higher density housing ends up paying for itself faster than single family homes do. Yes, there's an issue of increased value of land as you upzone it to be able to accommodate higher density uses. And so there should be some return to the city from property values as well. But the underlying point is that city services are strained as we sort of sprawl and build lower density housing. And there are actually efficiencies for higher density uses of space.
3 points. Okay. One is our city services are not just paid by the people who build or live in homes. We have shopping centers, we have hotels, we have office buildings. Supporting city services has always been a shared responsibility. Two, as Matthew said, the money that you get from housing depends on the value of the housing on the lot. So more density makes a difference. And three, when did that become a criteria? That's a funny criteria. On no other thing do we say we want to reduce overcrowding. We want to let low-income kids have access to good resources. We want people to live closer to jobs to reduce their commute. But if it doesn't pay off to the city, we won't do it. That's illegal for the first thing, and that's a very questionable issue. But it does raise something that's being discussed in the legislature from time to time that I think is very good, which is changing the property tax and the total tax system so that housing brings more revenue to cities. That will ease this fight and avoid legal challenges.
Thank you. Bella, did you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. All right. To accommodate the RHNA allocation, what kind of built form makes sense from a land use and transportation perspective? All ADUs, all along transit corridors? I think I have a sense of your answers, but I'd love to hear it.
I think probably a little bit of everything. So here's where local control comes into play. Local control means that a city, Palo Alto, Redwood City, Sunnyvale, gets to design their way to meet the target. It doesn't mean you get to say no to the target. It means you get to do your way. So in my city, there's a discussion of what's called the Fry site. There's a discussion of whether housing makes sense on San Antonio. There's a discussion, as Matthew said, as to how much we can accommodate with ADUs. The state has been talking about something we've been talking about locally. Can we do more with duplexes and triplexes and small apartments? And then I think the place where I live, 2 blocks from University Avenue, where the car rarely leaves the garage and it's walkable, I think our downtowns are great places for housing, particularly for seniors. It just serves so many social purposes. But a little bit of everything. I think there's no one right answer.
I would agree. If I could say one thing, that we have changed a little bit our understanding about how people move between work and home. And for decades, we've been really focused on access to public transit, which is super important. It's critical. I guarantee at some point we're all going to be taking public transit because it's going to be the fastest, least costly, and most efficient way to get from point A to point B in the Bay Area. For now, though, a lot of people drive. And so the new rules, rather than just figuring out how many people get in their cars, the new standard actually looks at how far people drive. It's called vehicle miles traveled. And so a lot of the focus of this RHNA round is trying to put people close to jobs, even if they're not right at bus stops in the highest density housing. They will be closer to where the job centers are. So even if they get in their car, it will be a 10-minute drive instead of a 90-minute drive. So that's a change in this round, and it's going to mean a higher expectation of some of the jobs-rich cities up the peninsula and in the Bay Area.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Has there been any data analysis of the impact of market rate housing development on the general affordability of housing within a community? If, for example, the development of low income and very low income housing development continues to be sporadic and infrequent, can we rely on new market rate housing to place downward pressure on the affordability of our existing and aging market rate housing stock? So this is kind of a trickle down question.
Steve, you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Yeah. I think it will be very hard to end up with lower prices and rents. I think what we're trying to do is stop the very excessive rise that has led to overcrowding and cost burden. One of the things that's true that's happened in recent years, because we have a massive housing shortage, that people with income have bid up units that used to be available to middle income or middle low income people, and has caused displacement or gentrification. And for me as an economist, that's because we simply haven't built enough housing. But the impact of not building enough housing has been very detrimental to low and low middle income groups, because the higher income folks are bidding up the prices. And I think that will be solved by extending more market rate housing.
Yeah, there's a lot of research that shows that in a functioning market, it takes a long time and it's only a percentage of the units, but building market rate units will lower costs for lower income renters. Unfortunately, the same research shows that our market is essentially broken in ways that Steve pointed out, and it hasn't been following those patterns at nearly the efficiency that it does in other parts of the country. So we like to say we need more housing of all types, but we can't build our way out of the affordable housing crisis at this point if we're going to address the needs of lower income people who are the foundation in many ways of major parts of the economy locally. We're going to have to figure out how to create affordable housing that they can afford.
Yeah, I think Matthew touched on a really important point. Some people see this as a dichotomy between housing for low income people and market rate housing. But what's happened in the past 6 years is that middle income people who used to have no trouble renting a house, or even for some of them buying a house, have been completely priced out. And I wouldn't want to overlook the need to build housing that's affordable to people who are making the median income, which around here it could be 120 or 140,000, but they can't afford $1 million house or 4,000 a month for rent. So we need to build types of housing. Priority is for our lowest income groups, but middle income groups are also struggling, as I'm sure people in the audience, some of them could attest. And I wouldn't want them left out.
Right. We're in a place where the median income in the county can't afford the average rent in the county. So not only are people priced out of home ownership, we're in sort of so out of balance that we're actually struggling to find housing that middle income people can afford, whether it's rental or home ownership. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so the next one, I'm gonna hand this to Matthew. Can you say a little bit more about how affirmatively furthering fair housing, although it was rescinded as a federal policy, can you say a little bit more about it, how it's
Absolutely.
in California?
Right, so some of you may have, if you were watching, some of you may have tracked that our president announced that he was rescinding fair housing for the suburbs. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is actually a section of the 1964 Fair Housing Act. And it has always been there, and it was not rescinded. It's never been fully implemented because it's pretty vague to figure out how do you promote integration as opposed to just stop discrimination. In 2015, the Obama administration came up with some rules for how to do that. When Trump became president, he suspended the implementation of those rules. So that happened immediately when he became president. So what happened a couple of weeks ago was actually just formalizing a process that happened in the first week of his presidency. In 2018, because of what was happening in Washington, the state of California decided to adopt its own law, implementing some of the vision of what had been in place under the Obama administration. And so we are now covered by state law to affirmatively further fair housing. So there was nothing about what our president did a couple of weeks ago that actually changed a law that was in place. It was an executive order to try and provide some clarity to a law that was passed in 1964. The fair housing law is still in place and is the law of the land, and California has an additional affirmatively furthering fair housing law, which is going to have a big impact on this next RHNA round.
Super helpful. So this one, I'm going to hand this first to Steve, I think, unless you can both hop in. How would a moratorium on new office space help us achieve our housing goals? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? How does a moratorium on office construction impact housing construction?
It doesn't. I guess some people think that. The first thing a moratorium on office development would do would be deprive the city of revenues and deprive small businesses, retail, and restaurants of customers. As I tried to say at the beginning, the RHNA allocation that we are given by the state and that will be allocated to the cities did not depend in any way on large future job growth. So the only thing an office moratorium does is deprive us of revenue and deprive us of customers. It is true that if there are offices that are no longer viable, more likely retail strips, because retail is downsizing, those properties, if they could be rezoned, could have opportunities. right now, I don't think my city has approved an office development in 2 or 3 years, and there are vacancies every place. So the idea that somehow office development is a barrier to meeting our RHNA goals is just not founded at all.
All right, I'm gonna ask this next one to Matthew. What happens if a city doesn't meet their goals?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the answer is that the rules may be changing on that front as well. In the past, the primary leverage that ABAG had was through funding for transportation and planning. And that was not a very effective stick, nor was it a very effective carrot in many cases. And so the state legislature has been looking very hard for ways of actually producing the units that are necessary and that are required per state law. And so a number of things that, you know, have been under discussion and are in place in one way or another that are related to this is a general streamlining of housing, and particularly affordable housing development in cities. So there are some laws that have been passed that, depending on what type of affordable housing, as long as it's in a residential area and it conforms with objective standards, it needs to be approved by right and does not require a discretionary or a council approval to go ahead as affordable housing. We will see more of that as we sort of stumble and fall and struggle to figure out how to produce the housing that we need. The state legislature has made it clear that it will be looking for other ways of ensuring that that housing is built. So we're seeing some sort of carryover as proposals for automatic upzoning or for by right development. There were a couple of bills this last time. There was one that would have allowed duplexes. There have been a number of ADU bills. All of them are driven by this challenge of how do we produce enough housing to
Yeah,
accommodate
I'll
the
defer to
citizens
Matthew,
that
let me modify that. A city is not required to meet its RHNA goal. It's required to plan and to have policies and zoning. All of what Matthew said, which I agree with, are incentives to help cities meet the goal. The penalties will come not from failing to meet the goal, but from developing transparently bogus site inventories or policies. HCD will be looking not whether you met the goal, but whether you affirmatively tried not to, by making projects infeasible, by not zoning enough sites. If you did something wrong, if you did everything right and developers didn't come or there was a massive recession, I don't think anybody is going to be penalized. It is a best effort with the state adding incentives to help cities make it work.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask, I'm kind of scrolling through, because we actually said that we would end in about 5 minutes, but we have a lot of questions. So first, let me just ask Steve and Matthew, can you both stay on for a few more minutes to get through a couple more of these?
Sure. I can.
Okay. All right. So this question is around land value. So we all talk a lot about the fact that one of the biggest barriers to building affordable housing is that land values are so high that it makes it really, really hard to build in cities like Palo Alto. So this question, he says, it's deliberately overstated, and not altogether serious, but given the price of land in Palo Alto and the complications of multiple site approvals, why wouldn't we just build a 100-story apartment building? So why don't we build 100 stories in Palo Alto?
I'm not really good at dealing with hypotheticals.
Maybe bring this back to how do height limits stop us from being able to meet our goals?
Okay. The way that we need to offset high land cost is really the set of policies that Matthew talked about. One of them is height. Palo Alto has a 50-foot height limit. Could that be 80 feet, not 250 feet? So you get more units per acre, and that reduces the cost and offsets the land cost. Another is reducing parking and retail requirements, which we have done for our low-income housing projects in Palo Alto. And ultimately, we're going to need either locally or from the region and state to raise more money. There's no question that the land costs are a barrier, but the law and public policy says we have to try and overcome that with creative policies and a whole lot of money.
So how does missing middle fit into RHNA and solving the housing crisis? This is for either of you.
Steve, I know this is important to you. Do you want to?
Okay. So first of all, missing middle has two meanings. One, it's about people and their income. And in the RHNA, there's a moderate income category from a little bit below the median income to a little bit above the median income. And as both Matthew and I have said, they can't afford the rents, much less the housing prices here. But there's also a meaning of missing middle, which goes to solutions, which is types of housing, duplexes and row houses, ADUs, small apartment buildings that can rent for less than fancy larger apartments. One of the ways that it's going to have to be solved is that people will be willing to accept smaller units. Simply the size of the unit affects the cost. And so zoning, as Matthew said, are we going to allow duplexes and row houses and small apartments in some of our residential areas? ADU policies, which because they're smaller, will rent for rents that are affordable to a whole lot more people. But it's the challenge that I hope doesn't get overlooked in our deep caring for very low income people who are most impacted, because they've always been at the bottom of the housing ladder. What's true in the last 6 or 7 years is that more and more middle income people are missing in the sense of having housing policies and housing types that can bring housing that's affordable to them. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, two things. I think it's really critical that we acknowledge that we have a real complex range of housing problems in the Bay Area, and each one requires a slightly different solution. And homes that are, affordable to middle income families is one of those challenges. We don't have subsidy dollars to build those homes, and so we have to figure out how to build them affordably. And that means creating a broader range of different housing options in the private market, as Steve mentioned. The only other thing that I would say is, even though the market is broken, it's still sort of a ladder. And so the fewer opportunities there are for middle income people at rents they can afford, the more likely they are to be driven into parts of the rental market that previously were occupied by lower income households and drive those rents up. And so, you know, it's very difficult to filter down efficiently, but building less expensive housing at a variety of points up that housing ladder is really going to be critical to the long-term stability of housing costs in the area.
There is something that Palo Alto did for, we created an overlay zone where instead of the developer being asked to provide a certain number of units for very low income people, with that zone, they're being asked to provide a certain number of units for middle income people. And that's part of a zone in Palo Alto. We have one project that was approved with that. I don't know how generally that would be. It's not a direct subsidy, but it's the same as a inclusionary zoning, but in this case for middle income residents.
All right. So we still have plenty of questions. I think people are leaving with lots of questions, which to me means that like this was actually helpful and interesting. But I want to kind of start to wrap this up, in part to respect your time, in part to respect my time, put my kids to bed, the complications of, you know, COVID life right now. So I kind of want to end on a positive note that I'm throwing out to the panelists. You know, I think often we get in these housing conversations about what can be built and the rules and the legislature and what happened and what didn't happen. I would love to hear kind of a success story. If Matthew or Steve, if either of you like have kind of, what's like your favorite housing memory? Yeah. Matthew's smiling, so I'm going to go with you. Do you have a favorite housing memory?
Favorite housing memory. Let me give you a couple quickly. One is that increasingly in the Bay Area and particularly in the South Bay, and particularly in Santa Clara County, we've been doing a better job of planning integrated mixed use communities that bring jobs and housing and commercial retail development together into complete communities to replace sprawling office campuses that were great in the 60s and 70s, but are not a very efficient use of space. So even though it's struggling to get off the ground, I think a major benchmark was in Mountain View when they approved the North Bay Shore Plan, in which Google committed to integrating 10,000 units of new housing, 20% of them affordable, into a large campus that would include a lot of new jobs. So that's one, and I think we're seeing similar things in other cities and even in San Jose, but the suburbs have definitely been driving that movement. The other one that I would say is a real success, and it's not done yet, is that we are on the cusp of building a 13-story affordable housing development in a new community in San Jose. And it has a broad range of income categories. A lot of the folks are going to be middle income. A lot of the folks are going to be significantly lower income. But our ability to have the confidence to take advantage of the limited space resources that we have and really optimize them and figure out how to do it affordably is a key to the future of how we're going to make this work. So for me, that's heartening.
Great. So I'll just share mine because I was like, I didn't actually have an answer until just now. You were talking and I was thinking about it and I was like, oh man, so I didn't start doing housing organizing until more recently in my career. And 2 or 3 years ago, I remember my colleague and we were going to have an event to talk about affordable housing and how you get more housing built. And we literally took clipboards to the park in San Mateo. We're just chasing people around, trying to talk to them about housing. And like, I mean, it's comical to think back about it. But we literally just had to wander around and find random strangers and try and convince them that housing was really an important conversation to be having. But today, we didn't try that hard, and we got 118 people to RSVP to tonight's event to talk about something that is very wonky and complicated. So I really want to thank all of the attendees who came, because I think it really shows that housing is an important issue that we are all really dedicated to finding solutions for. So thank you to our panelists. Steve, did you have anything you want to add?
What gives me hope is, and I've listened to all of the ABAG methodology committees, is that even people who really wish the housing targets were lower could all agree that low-income families do better if they're able to be housed in high-resource areas, and that the environment is improved if we're able to locate jobs closer to housing. Even the people representing cities that didn't want more housing in their area, no one objected to the social policy. And if that agreement on helping low-income families and reducing commutes can be brought forward, that will be a basis for each city to really proactively develop a housing element that works.
Great. Well, I hope we can bring all of this energy into all of our city's housing element processes. For all of you who are still listening, probably tomorrow we will send you out the recording and the slides. And if you have any questions, I hope you will reach out to us. Palo Alto Forward is here as a resource for folks in Palo Alto who want to be more involved in Palo Alto. SV at Home is an incredible resource throughout Santa Clara County, and the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County, my former employer, so I'm a little biased, is also doing great work throughout San Mateo County. So I hope folks will jump in and get involved and learn how we can really make space for new neighbors. All right.
Can you leave this live for just a minute so I can look at the other questions in the chat?
I will end the recording and I will, so you can stay on and look at that. Thanks, everybody.